My name is Samir Najjar, and what I'm about to share with you is not something I ever thought I would speak out loud, let alone on a platform like this. For most of my life, I was a devout Muslim. I was born in Damascus, Syria, raised in a household where prayer was more than ritual. It was rhythm, breath, foundation. My father was an Islamic scholar. My grandfather before him a respected muezzin. From my earliest memories, the voice of the Quran was the soundtrack of my world. I memorized surahs by candlelight. I led prayer before I was tall enough to reach the shelves of books in my father's study. Faith wasn't just something I practiced. It was who I was. When the war came, we fled. I brought my wife, Layla, and our children to the United States, hoping to escape the violence that swallowed my homeland. We settled in Dearborn, Michigan, a place that felt almost familiar with its mosques, Arabic markets, and sense of cultural memory. There, I became a community teacher, helping immigrant youth hold on to their identity while finding their way in a strange new land. I never considered myself an extremist or political man. I was a man of discipline, tradition, study. I believed in Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, and the truth of the Quran with all my heart. So you can understand how everything that happened in the summer of 2016 didn't just shake my faith. It tore it down to its foundation, and what was rebuilt in its place was something I never expected. That July, I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. At first, I thought it was just a fatigue. I had been feeling drained for months, but I blamed on age, on stress, on long hours at the center. But when I could no longer eat without pain, Layla forced me to see a doctor. The test came quickly. The answers were swift and brutal. I had months, maybe weeks. My liver was already affected. Surgery was an option. The doctors offered chemotherapy, but they admitted it would be unlikely to save me. I told myself it was Allah's will. I remember the stories of prophets tested by suffering. I whispered verses at night, even when the pain made it hard to form words. Every prayer felt like a last conversation with the one I had worshipped since childhood. If I died tonight, I would pray, let it be in peace. Let me be found faithful. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. One night, after a particularly rough round of treatment, I felt a pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away. Layla had just stepped out to get tea. I was alone. The pain grew sharper, hotter, like fire inside my ribcage. I reached the call button, but my fingers couldn't find it. My vision blurred. I collapsed back onto the bed. The last thing I remember hearing was the sound of my heart monitor screaming into the silence. Then silence. But I wasn't gone. I was still there, but not in my body. I hovered above the hospital bed, watching doctors and nurses rush in. One of them pressed hard on my chest. Another fumbled with a defibrillator. A third shouted for backup. I should have felt panic. Instead, I felt nothing but stillness, weightlessness. I was conscious, more aware than I'd ever been, but somehow free from the fear I thought would greet death. It was like stepping through a veil, the veil of life. Then came the light. At first, it felt familiar, warm, even. I heard sounds, soft songs in Arabic, the call to prayer echoing faintly. my mother's lullaby from childhood. I felt drawn toward it. I remember whispering, "Praise be to Allah," thinking I had entered paradise. My heart filled with wonder. It felt like the moment I had always imagined. Like every prayer, every fast, every act of devotion had finally brought me home. But then it changed. The light dimmed. The warmth vanished. The songs distorted. What was once beautiful became unbearable. The trees withered before my eyes. Flowers turned to ash. A thick, foul stench filled the air. I tried to move, but my limbs were no longer mine. I was in a realm that no longer felt like heaven, but something else. Something twisted. Then I heard cries. Not just any cries, agonizing wails of men, women, even children. They came from every direction, but there were no faces, just echoes of sorrow. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. Then I heard my mother's voice, clear, trembling, desperate. "Have mercy." I screamed. I cried out in every way I knew how, but no words came. I was suspended in a void, suffocating not from lack of air, but from despair. And then came the voice, a voice so powerful it didn't need volume. It didn't speak to my ears. It spoke through my bones, through my thoughts, through the very fiber of my soul. "Samir, everything will now be revealed." When that voice said, "Everything will now be revealed," I felt like the entire spiritual weight of the universe settled on me. The darkness around me peeled away, not into light, at least not yet, but into vision. I was no longer in the void. I was somewhere vast, timeless. Before me rose a throne, so high, so awe-striking, I could barely look at it. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed. I wasn't sure if I was in heaven, in judgment, or in something beyond either. On the throne sat a figure bound in chains. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The man was familiar, his face lined with sorrow, his posture low, hands bound. My breath caught in my chest when I realized who it was, the Prophet Muhammad. I cried out in disbelief. "No, this isn't right. This can't be right." I had devoted my life to his teachings. I had led others to follow his example. And yet here he was, bound, grieving, silent. The voice returned. "You honored a man more than me." Tears poured from my eyes. I didn't know. I thought I was doing right. My heart cracked open. This wasn't accusation. It was revelation. A book descended from above, my sacred text, the Quran. The pages flipped themselves as if held by an unseen hand. I watched as passages I had once recited were shown to me again, but this time with clarity I had never experienced. Then questions came, sharp, searing, divine. "Who is Allah, Samir? Have you truly asked? Do you know his origin?" The visions came fast now. The Kaaba, long before Islam, surrounded by idols, Al-Azza, Manat, Hubal. I saw the name Allah etched beside them, not as the only God, but one among many. I saw inscriptions of the god El and Baal, and how names bled into one another through history. My mind screamed in resistance, but my spirit, it couldn't deny what I was seeing. "You followed the teachings of men who did not know me," the voice said. The tears would not stop. I thought of all the people I had taught, all the times I dismissed questions, all the youth who walked away with more tradition than truth. I thought of Sarah, the bright teenage girl who once asked me, "Why does Allah feel so distant?" I told her to have more faith. I silenced what may have been the Spirit's first stirring in her heart. I thought of my son Kareem, who once asked me in pain, "If Allah is merciful, why did he let my friend die?" I told him to trust in the test. But I hadn't had the answers, not really. I had doctrine, I had ritual, but I had no relationship. Then the light returned. It didn't just shine, it consumed everything. In the center of it stood a man, clothed in white, eyes burning with both fire and gentleness. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. But I knew who he was. It was Jesus, not a prophet, not a teacher, not just a man. He was the very source of the light itself. He didn't accuse. He didn't lecture. He stepped toward me and lifted me from my knees. The chains that had gripped my mind, my spirit, my identity, they fell. He looked at me like he had known me before I was born. Then he said, "You have been searching for me your whole life, Samir, but you didn't know my name." I wept harder than I ever had before. All my pride, all my defenses, they melted. I couldn't argue. I didn't want to argue. I had never felt love like this. It wasn't just affection. It was power. It was purpose. It was home. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And just like that, I woke up. I gasped so violently the nurse nearly dropped the tray in her hand. Alarms blared. Doctors rushed in. But I was no longer the man they had last seen slipping into death. I was awake, alive, and undone. They said I had no heartbeat for nearly 3 minutes. They said it was a miracle, but I knew the real miracle wasn't that I had come back. The miracle was that I had met truth, and his name was Jesus. The days that followed were the most confusing of my life. I couldn't lead prayers. I couldn't read the Quran without tears. I withdrew. Layla watched me with worry, but she didn't press. She knew something had changed. My community whispered. Some said I was cracking from illness. Others blamed the West. But I knew what I had seen. I began reading, researching. I studied the roots of pre-Islamic Arabia. I looked into ancient Semitic languages, early Near Eastern worship. The questions the voice had asked me haunted me and led me, and through it all, I began to see how deeply man had shaped what I once believed to be divine. Then one afternoon, during a quiet checkup, my Christian oncologist, Dr. Thompson, gently asked me if I was okay. I hadn't told anyone, but something in her voice opened the door. "You saw something, didn't you?" she said. I nodded, trembling. We talked for hours, not about religion, but about truth. She told me how she, too, once followed religion until she met Jesus, not as a doctrine, but as a living Savior. I broke down. I told her everything, and she didn't try to convert me. She listened. She prayed. Then came the chaplain, a man named Father John. He visited without knowing my story, but as soon as he looked at me, he said, The Lord's been speaking to you, hasn't he? That night, I went into the hospital garden under a sky full of stars, and I whispered for the first time in my life a prayer I never expected to pray. Creator, if it's really you I saw, if Jesus is the truth, I am listening. The next day, I walked into a small church nearby. I didn't know the songs. I didn't know the customs, but I knew I had to be there. I met the pastor. I told him everything, and a week later, I was baptized. When the water washed over me, I felt something break. The heaviness, the guilt, the confusion. It was gone. What remained was peace, real peace, not from ritual, not from rules, but from grace. I read the Bible with hunger I hadn't felt in decades. I saw Jesus' words come alive. I fell in love with the way he spoke, how he treated the broken, how he touched the untouchable. He didn't call me to perfection. He called me to himself. And then something else happened. My doctors ran scans again. My cancer, gone, vanished. They called it unexplainable. But I knew who healed me, who saved me. Now I am no longer an imam. I am not a religious leader. I am just a man who died and met the truth. His name is Jesus.